Hello all you YouTubers, this is Victoria. Today I'm going to start on my Sabbath series, and I've got my little stopwatch here so I won't go over 10 minutes. And I'm going to start with a series of claims and responses about the Sabbath. And like I said earlier, I'll be reading these, but it is my work that I have written. So it is mine. It's easier for me to read the answers that I've written than to try to explain everything off the top of my head. Okay, so here we go. Claim number 1. There is only one kind of law. My response is the law in the Torah is composed of 3 parts: ceremonial, civil, and moral. The civil laws are those that applied to Israel only in that time and place under that theocracy, but they vary from culture to culture and place to place. For example, Jews could not stone a man to death for adultery because Roman law forbade them to do so, even though under Israel's theocracy it was the law of the land. The ceremonial laws are those which Jesus fulfilled, such as the laws of sacrifice. As Christians, we do not need to keep them anymore. The moral laws are those which we naturally know and which can never be fulfilled. They are eternal, in place until Christ comes again to create the new heaven and new earth. It is under this category that the 10 Commandments fall. The New Testament itself makes a distinction between ceremonial and moral law. In 1 Corinthians 7:19, where Paul makes a distinction between circumcision, clearly done away with in the New Covenant, and the keeping of the commandments of God, quote-unquote, the keeping of the commandments of God, which we are urged to do. Clearly there is a distinction between ceremonial and moral law here. Okay, that's number 1. I also want to say that all of the Bible quotations I use are from the New American Standard Bible, which is my personally preferred version. Okay, claim number 2. The Sabbath commandment is not mentioned in the New Testament, only 9 commandments are. My response: oftentimes Christians try to say that only 9 of the 10 commandments are repeated in the New Testament, therefore we only have to keep those 9. What one can we ignore? The Sabbath, of course. But what they are overlooking is one of the most obvious features of the New Testament. The Sabbath is talked about in great detail in the Gospels. Why, if the Sabbath had been done away with, are there so many mentions? Why mention something that has been done away with, mention it often, and mention it with no direct command from Christ to stop celebrating it? The Gospels were written between AD 60, with Mark being the earliest, and AD 90, with John being the latest. It is generally recognized that far from being mere biographies, the Gospels were handbooks for the early church. If the Sabbath had been done away with by Jesus or the apostles, it would seem likely that the Sabbath would be de-emphasized in the writings, and likely Sunday given some kind of boost. Yet we don't find that. We find numerous references in these writings to a practice that some say was no longer observed. Why mention the Sabbath so much if it didn't matter anymore? The Gospels were all written after the epistles, and if the Sabbath had already been abandoned by then, why include so many instances of it in the writings? It would have been irrelevant to the early church, so why make so much mention of it? It was mentioned so much precisely because the church was still keeping it. In the stories of Jesus, the early church saw how the Sabbath should be kept and the original meaning that Jesus brought back to it. Okay. How am I doing on time? Check my time. Alright. Next claim. Jesus rose on Sunday, so that's why we celebrate on Sunday. My response: yes, Jesus rose from the grave on Sunday. This is not something I'm going to dispute, although some would. But we are not told by Jesus the apostles, or any other biblical writer that the day of rest and worship is to change because of it. Jesus talked to his disciples many times after his resurrection. That would have been the perfect time to say, look, I know you have always rested and worshipped on Saturday, but I give you a new commandment. The Sabbath shall now be Sunday. Surely the gospel writers would not have failed to write down something that important. If Jesus or any of the writers of the New Testament writers had any such command, I'd be resting on Sunday. In the absence of any biblical mandate, however, I have to conclude that the Sunday Sabbath is the tradition of men. All right. Pull my papers. All right. Next claim, Jesus broke the Sabbath. The Pharisees accused Jesus and his disciples of breaking the Sabbath, but there is not one law from the Bible that Jesus actually broke. The only laws he broke were the rabbinical ones defining what work was. There were 39 of these. When the disciples were going through the grain fields on the Sabbath and plucking the grain to eat, the Pharisees felt the disciples were breaking the laws against harvesting, picking the corn or wheat, threshing, shucking it or rubbing it between their palms, among others. They did not break one single law from the Bible in doing this. As for his healing miracles, Jesus said it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. This includes all kinds of work done to save lives, physically or spiritually. This is the reason no Sabbath keeper argues against essential services continuing, such as hospitals and police, and the reason pastors can work that day and still be guiltless. The priests worked in the temple that day and were held guiltless. When Jesus healed, he was doing redemptive work, which was fine, and is fine. Alright, squeeze one more in. Next claim, the Sabbath is any seventh day after 6 days of work. My reply, if the spirit of the law is simply 1 day out of 7, how come the priests were not commanded to rest one of the other days? They took turns serving in the temple for a certain term. During that term, they would work harder on the Sabbath than on any other day, yet there is no law telling them to rest Sunday or Monday or every seventh day. If God had meant every seventh day after 6 days of work, we'd find some kind of law like that for the priests. Additionally, the Sabbath is the only day that God blessed. If the Sabbath were any seventh day, there would be no need for God to bless a specific day. Also, God would have told the Israelites to keep whatever day was convenient for them rather than telling them what day they were to keep. Okay, I'm going to end for now so I don't go over 10 minutes, and I will continue in another video. This is Sabbath Part 1. Thanks.